India, the land of billion dreams, rising as a global powerhouse, yet across the world, many nations don't see India's success, instead, they shame it. From powerful Western countries to neighboring rivals, India is constantly criticized for its poverty, corruption, inequality, and human rights record. But why do these countries continue to point fingers at Indians? And which nations in 2025 stand at the top of this list? Stay with us, because today we reveal the top 15 countries that shame Indians in 2025, and number 1 will shock you. 15. Norway. Norway, admired for its progressive values, often criticizes India's human rights and gender equality records. The Scandinavian nation points to caste-based discrimination, women's safety issues, and poor press freedom in India as examples of societal backwardness. Norway also stresses India's environmental neglect, highlighting pollution and overpopulation as urgent concerns. While trade and diplomatic relations remain stable, Norwegians often see India as lagging behind the standards of a modern welfare society. This moral superiority, along with Norway's consistent role in global human rights discussions, makes it one of the countries that indirectly shames Indians on the international stage. 14. Germany. Germany frequently criticizes India for its poor labor laws, low wages, and lack of workers' rights. German media often highlights child labor, caste discrimination, and corruption scandals, portraying India as a country still struggling with basic fairness and justice. Environmental concerns are another major point, with Germans criticizing India's heavy reliance on coal and slow action on climate change. Indian students and workers in Germany sometimes face stereotypes of being less disciplined compared to Europeans. Despite strong economic ties, Germany's critical stance in political, social, and environmental discussions often leaves Indians feeling shamed on global platforms. 13. United Kingdom. The UK, with its colonial past, often takes a patronizing tone toward India. British media outlets regularly highlight India's poverty, pollution, and religious conflicts, overshadowing its economic and technological progress. Indians in the UK sometimes face prejudice tied to outdated stereotypes of being cheap laborers or overly traditional. Political debates also tend to shame India over its human rights issues, especially regarding religious freedom and minority treatment. Despite a large Indian diaspora contributing to British society, the UK continues to position itself as morally superior, reminding India of its flaws rather than celebrating its growth and achievements. 12. Canada. Canada's relationship with India has soured in recent years, largely due to political disputes and diaspora tensions. Canadian politicians and media often highlight issues of religious intolerance, minority rights, and women's safety in India, painting a negative image. Reports of racism and caste bias among Indian immigrants also spark heated debates in Canadian society. Moreover, Canada criticizes India's democratic backsliding and restrictions on press freedom. Though many Indians study and settle in Canada, the country's public discourse frequently shames India, portraying it as a nation struggling to meet the values of freedom, equality, and justice upheld in Canada. 11. Sweden. Sweden, a country celebrated for its progressive values, often calls out India on gender equality and human rights. Indian society is seen as too patriarchal and slow to modernize, leading to criticism of its women's safety and social justice issues. Environmental activists in Sweden also shame India for its pollution crisis and heavy dependence on fossil fuels. Additionally, Indian immigrants sometimes face subtle bias, as Swedes view them through stereotypes of corruption or poverty. While India values Sweden's technology and innovation, Sweden often uses its international voice to shame India, highlighting its social and environmental shortcomings. 10. United States. The United States is home to millions of successful Indians, yet it also frequently shames India on global platforms. American politicians and media highlight India's religious intolerance, caste discrimination, and democratic challenges. Reports of human rights abuses and press restrictions are widely discussed in Washington. Indian immigrants sometimes face stereotypes of being cheap labor, overly competitive, or too traditional. Furthermore, the US often criticizes India's environmental policies, especially its dependence on coal. While ties remain strong in trade and defense, the US continues to project India as a developing nation struggling to match global democratic and economic standards. 9. France. France often criticizes India for its religious conflicts and slow social progress. French media outlets frequently portray India as a chaotic society plagued by poverty, inequality, and corruption. The country's intellectual circles highlight India's lack of women's safety, caste oppression, and environmental destruction, framing it as backward compared to European values. Indians in France may also face cultural barriers, where they are stereotyped as overly traditional or not integrated. Despite growing business and defense partnerships, France continues to shame India in cultural and political discussions, focusing more on its weaknesses than its technological and economic rise. 8. Australia. Australia is a popular destination for Indian students and workers, yet it often shames India in social and political debates. Issues such as gender-based violence, caste discrimination, and poor sanitation are frequently raised in Australian media. Racial tensions between Indian immigrants and locals also create negative narratives. Environmental concerns add to the criticism, with India being portrayed as a major polluter. Despite a strong trade relationship and shared democratic values, Australians often position India as underdeveloped and socially problematic, leaving Indians feeling judged rather than respected in one of their favorite destinations for education and migration. 7. Switzerland. Switzerland, known for its wealth and neutrality, often shames India by highlighting its poverty, corruption, and inequality. The Swiss media frequently points out the vast gap between India's rich and poor, framing it as a failure of governance. India's slow legal system and issues of women's safety are also criticized. In global forums, Switzerland tends to portray India as unstable in terms of social justice and transparency. While many Indians admire Switzerland's lifestyle and visit as tourists, the Swiss perception often paints India as a struggling nation, reinforcing stereotypes that shame Indians on international platforms. 6. Denmark. Denmark, one of the world's happiest nations, often highlights India's social challenges as failures. Danish institutions shame India for its lack of gender equality, poor healthcare, and widespread corruption. Environmental issues, such as India's air pollution and reliance on fossil fuels, are also widely criticized. Indian immigrants in Denmark often face subtle stereotypes of being from a socially backward and chaotic nation. While India respects Denmark's renewable energy leadership, Danes frequently hold up their country as a model, contrasting it with India's shortcomings. This persistent comparison places India in a negative light on the world stage. 5. Japan. Japan admires India's growing economy but often shames it for inefficiency, corruption, and poor infrastructure. Japanese society, known for its discipline and cleanliness, views India's chaotic cities, lack of sanitation, and pollution as signs of backwardness. While the two nations cooperate in technology and defense, Japanese media sometimes portrays India as unreliable in delivering on big promises. Indian workers in Japan occasionally face bias, as cultural differences create barriers. Despite deepening ties, Japan subtly shames India by holding itself up as a symbol of efficiency and modernity compared to India's ongoing developmental struggles. 4. Netherlands. The Netherlands often highlights India's weaknesses in freedom of expression, minority rights, and corruption. Dutch media portrays India as a country struggling with intolerance and outdated traditions. Environmental activists in the Netherlands are especially critical of India's pollution and slow climate action. Indian immigrants, though contributing to Dutch society, sometimes face prejudice tied to stereotypes of being cheap labor or too conservative. While India and the Netherlands maintain strong business ties, the Dutch public discourse often positions India as a nation still catching up, shaming it when compared with Europe's high standards of democracy and equality. 3. Belgium. Belgium frequently shames India for its caste system, religious violence, and poor human rights record. Belgian institutions often highlight India's corruption and lack of transparency in governance. Media coverage tends to portray India as socially divided and politically unstable, overshadowing its progress in technology and economy. Indians in Belgium sometimes face cultural bias, where they are viewed as coming from a regressive society. Despite growing trade and educational ties, Belgium's criticism of India's democracy, women's rights, and environmental negligence often reinforces a negative image, making Indians feel judged rather than acknowledged for their achievements. 2. United Arab Emirates. The UAE is home to millions of Indians, yet it often shames India in subtle ways. Indian workers, especially laborers, face stereotypes of being poor, unskilled, or submissive. Despite their huge contribution to the UAE's economy, many Indians struggle with social inequality and discrimination. Emirati elites sometimes criticize India's poverty, corruption, and infrastructure problems, portraying the country as underdeveloped compared to the glittering Gulf states. Even though India and the UAE share deep business and cultural ties, the daily experiences of many Indians reflect a sense of being looked down upon, reinforcing feelings of shame and inferiority. 1. China. China is India's biggest regional rival and often shames it openly on international platforms. Chinese media highlights India's poverty, pollution, religious conflicts, and internal divisions to portray it as weak and unstable. China frequently contrasts its own rapid development with India's slower progress, emphasizing India's inefficiency, corruption, and poor infrastructure. On global issues like technology, trade, and defense, China portrays India as a junior competitor rather than an equal power. This constant comparison, along with border tensions and political rivalry, makes China the country that shames India the most in 2025, both regionally and globally.